All right, everybody, welcome to For the Love of Language. I'm EJ.
And I'm Stacie. We hope that you are doing well on whatever day you're listening to this. We don't say that enough. Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing okay.
Seriously, it's a good day,
It's
hopefully,
a
wherever you're
good
at.
day. It's a good day. It's a good day for us. EJ and I are having a great time.
We are.
And we wanted to talk about some language stuff. Today we decided we wanted to dive into the topic of markedness more.
Which we did bring up in one of our previous episodes as something we'd come
Yeah.
back to. So now we're coming back to it.
Now we're coming back to it. Yeah, we do sometimes come back to the tangents that we mentioned in previous episodes because sometimes they're worth going into. And
Yeah.
I'm personally really excited to talk about markedness because it's something that like it's a huge pivotal theory within the topic of linguistics. Like people throw out, oh, this is the way it is because of markedness, like all the time. Like markedness theory is just everywhere. But what people don't always realize is that markedness is not just like an element of linguistics, it's a broader element of like human cognition. So
Okay.
this is especially like as this is especially spicy for people who are like not only language fans but like interested in how the human brain works.
So let's take a step back before we dive deeper
For
into
sure.
everything, and let's
Yeah.
just give a basic definition of markedness. So maybe I'll go for the basic definition, and
Go
then
for it.
Stacie can like go haywire. Um,
I did prepare in advance for this. I have citations, folks.
oh yes, we're excited. So markedness is the idea that in linguistics you have ways that things are generally said, and those are unmarked expressions. Like the normal way of expressing something is unmarked. And then when you have something that is the abnormal, the less common way of expressing something, and this can apply to semantics, it can apply to syntax, it can apply to multiple facets of linguistics, but the less common way of saying something is the marked way of saying it. And so I think in our previous episode, I gave the example of ladies and gentlemen as an unmarked expression. But if you switch it
Mm-hmm.
around and say gentlemen and ladies, then suddenly it's marked. It's different. It catches your attention. And you have
Yes.
lots of similar things. Like people always say brothers and sisters. You can say sisters and brothers, and then suddenly that's marked. And those are both people examples, but there's all sorts of things that we just typically say. And then if you change them, if you mix things up, if you do something in a less common way, then that is marked.
Yes. And I want to narrow some of these examples down a little bit. So that is a good example of like idiomatic phrases or, larger pragmatic examples of how we see kind of markingness show up. But we also see it in other ways as well. So another example in like syntax, for example, a slightly more niche example is plurality, right? And most of the time, when you're speaking about things, you're speaking about things in a singular form. And so the singular form is usually more simple in terms of like complexity. There's usually less morphemes involved. There's less attachments to things. Like usually, like the if you're talking about something in the singular form, it's kind of like the bare naked form. You always learn the singular form first, and then when you start having more than one thing, that's when you start adding additional morphemes, additional complexity. And we kind of talked about this. And this is why this came up in our numbers episode, right? Because, you have like dog. And to talk about a dog is just, you have the one dog, and dog is great, and dog is a nice, simple word. But as soon as you have two dogs, oh, now we have an S at the end of the word dogs. All of a sudden, it becomes marked. It becomes a little bit different. And if you add more stuff, if we were speaking in another language, we might be adding, if there was two dogs in Arabic, then we have a completely different conjugation that's separate from just the one dog or like a group of dogs, so we have these other marked forms for plurality. And then if we want to go even more narrow into phonology, even, this is an example that was brought up in this book that I'm going to be referencing. It's from like 1986. It's just called Markedness. And I'm going to be particularly just referencing like the intro because it has a whole, like, it's an entire book just about markedness theory and linguistics. But
Who's the book by?
the book is like most linguistics books, it's a compilation of different like authors. But the overview is done by oh God, I'm butchering this name. Moravcsik. It's like a Russian name. I'm gonna spell it out. Moravcsik.
Okay, so what we're gonna do, Stacie is gonna message me the details about this book, and I'm gonna put it in the description of this podcast episode.
Yes. And Wirth, I can pronounce the second name. So it's got two different authors. But I'll post the details. But in their example, they give a phonological example of how more often than not, voiceless stops are more widely distributed than voiced stops.
Let's take a step back for those of our audience who don't know what a voiceless stop is. So just super quickly, a stop is one of those consonants that you hear in an instant. So like a T, a P, those are stops as opposed to like an M or a Z that you can just like hold. And then voiceless means that your vocal cords aren't vibrating. So a voiced stop would be a D, like as in dad, versus a voiceless one would be T, like tadpole.
Yes, exactly. And so what we see in languages, just broadly speaking, is that voiceless stops tend to have a wider distribution, or at least a perceived wider distribution than voiced stops do. Just given the like, given where they occur in words, because voiceless stops usually occur at the beginning of a word or at the end of the word, whereas voiced stops are usually like in the middle of words and not often at the ends of words. And so that's like a smaller example. And so you would say that like, oh, it's more often than not, if you see a voiced stop, it's probably the more marked, it's probably less common than a voiceless stop would be. So those are just like a few other examples of how markedness kind of like trickles down the system from like broad, just like, oh, I'm noticing that this is like more common and this is less common, or this is more familiar, all the way down to just like in terms of correlation and distribution. This is how we're generally seeing things. And that was an interesting point that I found in this overview as well, is that this really is a matter of like perception and correlation. And this is really like markedness is like a theory, because it's really hard to like prove that a lot of these things are marked. Like you'd have to do some really hardcore statistics to like really see if it's true that like one thing is more normal than like another thing, of like there's just more of a distribution of these things than there are of those things. So this whole thing really, like markedness really kind of affects our overall perception and the way we do science in general.
I like those examples. I like those examples a lot. It kind of broadens the scope. When you say that it's like difficult to determine these things, the contrarian in my brain is like corpora.
Just corpora, just like a bunch of statistics. Let's just do all the statistics.
Right. So like if you did want to analyze stuff like this, there are actually plenty of written corpora, where you can look at collocates, so words that are commonly placed next to each other, where you can find the frequency of both words and phrases. But those do of course have their own limitations, and like a couple limitations that you might find are like written speech is not the same as spoken speech. That was the wrong way to say that. Written language is not written language.
Elegant.
Thank you. Written language is not the same as spoken language. Like we are actively taught written language and how to do it differently and rules and things around it. And people they write differently than they speak a lot of the time. And so there's limitations in if you're looking at these written corpora, they might not actually be reflective of the way that people are actually communicating in real life. And, based on, whatever corpus you're looking at, you'll have, whatever limitations are attached to that. But I did just want to throw that out there. Like there are ways that we can very definitively research this and, get those statistics, make it work for us.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot that's really nebulous and up to opinion of like, maybe one dialect does it this way, maybe another dialect does it that way. And like, can you as a speaker of a single dialect say like, oh, the way that I say this is the unmarked way? Like, you could get a little bit controversial, might be a little problematic.
Yeah. Speaking of problematic, I will say this book was written in the 80s, and they have one example that I think is a really good example of like everyday markedness in terms of like familiarity and how it affects our perception. They don't handle it well in terms of the language that they use to discuss it, but it is like a good example. And that example is that if you live in a society that is predominantly white, or you are existing among people who are white, you tend to notice bigger differences among white people than if you were to see like a person of color. Like if you were to see like another group of another person, they give an example of like Asian people. Some people, like some white people, will say, oh, I can't tell the difference between Asian people. They all look to be the same to me. But that's just an element of markedness. Because you're more familiar with white people, you notice the differences between white people more than you would notice the differences between Asian people more. That doesn't mean that there's not any differences between Asian people. To the contrary, everybody's different, and it's just a matter of like, what is your brain familiar with? What kinds of differences are you noticing? And because you're working within like a certain set, you're only noticing differences within that set, and outside of that set you say, oh, that's just like too different for me to like notice some of the nuances of it. And I thought that was a very interesting example of markedness and how that affects our perception of like, this happens in science too. And so like we can be like, oh yeah, no, we can do statistics and we can do all this stuff, but even the research that we're focusing on, even the like phenomenon that we're interested in looking at, is flavored by our own sense of familiarity with whatever language or languages that we're studying.
Yes, that's an excellent point. So like the things that you're exposed to and the things that you're familiar with and frequently distinguish between kind of help guide what you're going to even register as different. So when you give that example, that also makes me think of a more phonetics based thing. So phonetics is like the pure sounds of language, right? So different languages have different phonemes, different base sounds that have meaning or that can change the meaning of a word. And so if you grow up just speaking English, then you might not differentiate between different Arabic sounds that don't exist in English. And so it's important.
Well, it's not that they don't exist in English, it's just that they're not utilized in a phonologically contrastive way in English, because people will make sounds all the time, right? People love fucking around with their vocal folds and making cool sounds, and the sounds can happen. It's just whether or not they're used in a way that's relevant to the language.
We could get into a really interesting discussion on universal grammar here, but I'm not going to go
we could.
But it is a good point. Like there are cases when we have allophones, which are sounds that are kind of registered as the same sound in a language with the same meaning, but they might be distinctive in another language.
Yes.
There's times when we do use these different sounds, but just interpret them as the same sound.
Yes.
Versus there actually might also be sounds in another language that we just don't use in English. So like, for example, in Icelandic, people frequently, well, not frequently, I've only heard it a few times, it's rather infrequent, but in Icelandic, people will occasionally speak while breathing in, which is something that I have legitimately never heard someone actually do conversationally in English. Like, so you do have things that, like, while they may exist in the universe, you actually wouldn't hear an English speaker say. And then you do have things that an English speaker would say, but just wouldn't differentiate as a separate sound from another one.
So an example of that second thing. So breathing in is definitely one of those more like, yeah, it could happen as like a fluke, but it's not like a strategic thing that happens. In contrast to in Hindi, for example, and some other languages in India, there is a contrast with aspiration. So aspiration is when air comes out of your mouth.
Mm,
And in English, aspiration usually happens with stops, like we mentioned before. So an example is like the letter P. So when I say P, you hear the air come out of my mouth and I'm aspirating that P. But you can have an unaspirated P. So you can have, it sounds almost like a B to the human ear, but it's different and it's distinctive and contrastive in Hindi. So you can have B, which is an unaspirated. I'm doing a not great job at it. It was an okay job at it. But you
it's
can have
okay.
an unaspirated P, which is contrasted with a B. So a B, and a P. And all of those are different and distinct for those who speak Hindi. But as speakers of English, we don't have that phonological contrast, so we don't notice if somebody is saying an aspirated P or an unaspirated P.
Mhm.
That's just like a phonetic fluke that can happen in English and nobody bats an eyelash, but it's something that's significant in another language.
Right. And you might have some of these things where, maybe someone's speaking with an accent and so they use a different variant than you're used to, but you still interpret it as the phoneme that's intended. And you could have like
Yeah.
allophones of the same phoneme that maybe they're both acceptable, but maybe one of them is abnormal and would therefore be seen as marked, which is kind of full circle where I was going to come with this
Yeah,
phonetics
yeah.
thing.
So to give an example of something that you referenced, something that my students would do, I had a lot of Spanish speakers, is they'd use the bilabial fricative, which is kind of in between a B and a V. So you have B and you have V, and then in certain dialects of Spanish, you have a sort of an in-between sound that's like a V. And so that is also an acceptable allophone. And so when my speakers were speaking in English, sometimes they might not get the B, sometimes they might not get the V. They'll do the bilabial fricative, the V.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example. So we've talked a lot about different ways that markedness can manifest itself, different examples and different aspects of linguistics. Why does it matter, Stacie?
Why does markedness matter? Why does markedness matter? Markedness matters, and markedness theory matters because it's all about our own personal perception, right? Like we talked about how there are these asymmetries that exist, but like why do we see these asymmetries? Why do these asymmetries exist? Why can't everything be treated the same? Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be great if everything was just treated the same? But that's
No.
just that's not how our brains work, and that's kind of just like, well, here's the thing. I couldn't tell you why markedness is a thing. I mean, I have personal theories, about like, oh, because we need to be able to sense things that are out of the ordinary, because things that are out of the ordinary might be like indicative of danger or whatever. And there's maybe some like primal little, rat brain instinct to it. But essentially all of human perception is finding commonalities, finding patterns, noticing familiarities, and then finding the distinctions among those
Hmm.
things as well. And so this is more just about like the asymmetry of human perception in general, and
Mm.
the way that we try to categorize things, and the kind of like inherent bias that comes with just noticing the world around us, which is absolutely wild. As scientists, we like to think that we exist in an unbiased state, but the fact of the matter is, just because of how human perception works, we're always going to notice things that are slightly different, or notice or be more, because of we're familiar with one thing, we might notice more discrepancies within it, and that's going to affect what we research, how we research it, and how we approach the research of it.
I think that's a good response. So another distinction that I would make within markedness, I
For
think
sure.
I would say that there's two different types of markedness. And
I
this
mean,
is just
according to the book, there's about 3 different kinds of markedness, but I don't want to go crazy into it.
okay. Well, there's different ways of splitting things up always, right?
Yes,
Like
yes,
there's all sorts of ways that you can talk about the colors of the rainbow that aren't like the 7 that we normally talk about. But the
right.
two that I'm thinking of that I want to make a distinction when we're talking about the why for markedness specifically is you have deliberate markedness and then you have almost accidental markedness. And I think when you're
Oh,
talking
yes.
about phonetics, phonology, a lot of those things, a lot of it can be just subconscious, almost accidental. Like this is just the way that I happen to be speaking.
Yeah, anything within syntax down through phonology and phonetics, like a lot, these are subconscious, unconscious systems that are going on inside of our brain that we're just very unconsciously aware of constantly.
Exactly. But then you also have the more semantics, pragmatic side of it, where I think it can get a little bit more artistic and
Mm-hmm.
deliberate, where you'll have speakers and writers, especially, deliberately changing, sometimes deliberately going against the norm to catch people's attention, to say
Yes.
something new.
Yeah.
And that's where I think there is a distinguishing feature there that I wanted to touch on is like you can use markedness deliberately in your own language to catch people's attention,
Absolutely.
to throw people off, to make a political statement if you want to go there.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can use idioms the way that people normally hear them and, speak in the generally accepted way and not make any waves. But that's just a little distinction I wanted to throw
No,
out
no, I
there.
appreciate that. I've actually had a couple comments from other people saying that they would like to hear us talk more broadly about general communication like habits of people. And I think that's something and we're planning on doing some more episodes that are kind of revolved around more of like the artistic use of language as well. So we've got stuff coming up. But I appreciate you mentioning that because I mean, as a linguist, I get super invested in some of these like subconscious efforts of like analyzing some of the really nitty-gritty, these little baby things. But it's true. A lot of like poets and a lot of writers will often say, okay, here's like the typical structure for this type of writing, for this type of poem, and then proceed to break the rules. And it's in that breaking of the rules that they make a point about something that all of a sudden what they have to say has more meaning because it's so very different from what you're usually used to. And I would go so far as to say that we see this even outside of language as well in the broader like art world because there's and this is something that I've just noticed among some of my artist friends is that like there are a lot of rules that you can follow in art that produce like typically beautiful art. And then there's like really weird shit where, for example, like one guy's art piece was just like 12 buckets of sand on top of each other and it fell down. Right. And because that's so different and because that's so weird and that's what not normally what people would think of as art, it caught people's attention. It got people talking. It got people discussing like, okay, well, what is art now if this is what we're considering art? It's like such a very interesting system that humans have built is like we love our rules and we've talked previously about how humans love rules, but like what fundamentally makes us humans is the fact that we have these rules and then we strategically break them,
Mm-hmm.
which I find
Yes,
absolutely beautiful. And it's true, like we do it all the time, all the time. It's just how, when, and where you're systematically breaking these social, linguistic, whatever, like rules to make your point.
exactly. Awesome. Well, I think that was a pretty good discussion of markedness. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. We I think we wrapped it up in a real nice pretty bow. We had a real big finish there at the end.
Loved it. Awesome. Well, please give us a rating and a review wherever you're listening. Contact us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time.
Thanks, folks. Have a good one.